Most people think they know who J.P. Morgan was. They picture the Monopoly Man mustache, the fierce glare, a Gilded Age robber baron who bought steel companies, collected art, and occasionally bailed out the United States government. It is a story of extreme wealth, ruthless ambition, and the wild, unregulated days of early American capitalism. But here's the thing. That story is dangerously incomplete. And in some ways, it entirely misses the point. Because John Pierpont Morgan wasn't just a wealthy industrialist. He didn't build railroads. He didn't invent new technologies. He didn't drill for oil like Rockefeller or forge steel like Carnegie. He did something far more profound and far more permanent. He built the architecture of the modern debt-based economy. Now, I'm not here to tell you that Morgan's wealth did not matter. Of course, it mattered. But here's the thing that most history books gloss over. Morgan's true legacy isn't the money he accumulated. It is the system he designed. A system where capital is not just a medium of exchange, but a mechanism of absolute control. A system where the people who finance the factories wield infinitely more power than the people who build them. And that story, the story of how one man transformed American capitalism from a system of producers into a system of financiers, is the one we are going to tell today. So let us go back, not to the Panic of 1907, not to the creation of U.S. Steel, but much further. Let me take you back to the very beginning. The year is 1857. A 20-year-old J.P. Morgan is sitting at a desk in London, working for his father, Junius Spencer Morgan. Junius was a partner in George Peabody and Company, one of the most powerful merchant banks in the world. George Peabody was an American who had moved to London to sell American state bonds to European investors. This is where the young Morgan learned his first and most important lesson. America was a developing nation, desperate for capital to build its canals, its railways, its infrastructure. Europe, particularly Britain, had the capital. The man who stood between American ambition and the European money controlled both. Morgan didn't just learn about banking in London, he learned about the geopolitical power of credit. Fast forward to 1861, the American Civil War erupts. While young men are dying by the hundreds of thousands on the battlefields of Antietam and Gettysburg, J.P. Morgan is back in New York, and he is realizing that war is not just a human tragedy. It is an unprecedented financial opportunity. In what became known as the Hall Carbine Affair, Morgan financed the purchase of 5,000 defective rifles from an Army arsenal at $350 each, and then resold them to a different Army general in the field for $22 each. The rifles had a tendency to blow off the thumbs of the soldiers firing them. When the government refused to pay for the defective weapons, Morgan didn't apologize. He sued the government for payment, and he won. Make of that what you will. But the Hall Carbine Affair was just a warm-up. The Civil War was expensive. The Union needed money, and European investors were hesitant to lend to a country tearing itself apart. Morgan saw the arbitrage. He traded in gold, manipulating the market to profit off the fluctuations in the Union's paper currency, the greenback. By the time the war ended in 1865, Morgan had amassed a quiet fortune. But more importantly, he had internalized a truth that would define the rest of his life. The state, for all its armies and all its laws, is entirely dependent on the financier when it needs capital. Now, let's move to the years. Following the Civil War, America was expanding at a terrifying pace. The frontier was closing, cities were exploding, and the defining technology of the era was the railroad. Between 1865 and 1890, the United States laid over 130,000 miles of track. Fortunes were made overnight. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, E.H. Harriman, they built massive empires. But the railroad industry was chaotic. It was defined by ruthless competition. Rival lines would slash prices to the point of bankruptcy just to drive a competitor out of business. They built parallel tracks, laid redundant lines, and issued millions of dollars in watered-down stock. It was boom and bust, a wildly inefficient free-for-all that terrified European investors. And European investors were Morgan's primary clients. When the British aristocrats who had bought American railroad bonds saw their investments cratering because of cutthroat competition, they called J.P. Morgan. And this is where Morgan introduced a concept that would fundamentally restructure the American economy: Morganization. Morganization was not about building better railroads. It was about eliminating competition. Morgan would step into a bankrupt or struggling railroad, fire the management, restructure the debt, and most importantly, place his own men on the board of directors. He created voting trusts, legal mechanisms that transferred the voting rights of the shareholders to Morgan and his partners. By the 1890s, Morgan controlled 1/6 of all the railway track in the United States. Think about what this would mean. The railroads were the arteries of the American economy. If you controlled the railroads, you controlled the price of shipping coal, steel, wheat, and manufactured goods. Morgan didn't lay a single mile of track. He didn't invent a better steam engine. He simply used the power of credit to reorganize the industry into a cartel. He believed that competition was wasteful, chaotic, and ruinous to profits. Consolidation, overseen by rational conservative bankers, meaning him, was the only way to ensure stability. This was a monumental shift. Power was moving from the industrialists, the men who actually built things, to the financiers, the men who financed the things being built. But railroads were just the beginning. The strategy of Morganization was applicable to any industry, provided you had enough capital. And in the late 1870s, a new industry was being born: electricity. Thomas Edison was a genius, a visionary inventor who held the patents that would light up the world. But Edison was not a financier. When Edison needed capital to build his first power station at Pearl Street in New York, he went to J.P. Morgan. Morgan financed Edison, recognizing that whoever controlled the electricity would control the future of American manufacturing. But Edison was stubborn. He insisted on using direct current, or DC, which was inefficient for long-distance transmission. His rival, George Westinghouse, was using alternating current, or AC, championed by Nikola Tesla. The war of the currents was fierce, expensive, and chaotic. And remember, Morgan despised chaos. He despised competition. By 1892, Edison's company was bleeding money. Morgan didn't care about Edison's visionary status. He cared about the balance sheet. So Morgan orchestrated a coup. He forced Edison to merge his company with the Thomson-Houston Electric Company, a major competitor that used AC power. The new company was called General Electric. Morgan dropped Edison's name from the company entirely. Edison, the man who invented the light bulb, the man who built the very foundation of the industry, was pushed to the margins of his own creation. General Electric was now controlled by Morgan's men. This is the essence of the system Morgan was building. The innovator creates the technology, but the financier reaps the monopoly profits. Once General Electric was formed, competition practically vanished. GE and Westinghouse cross-licensed their patents, effectively carving up the electrical market between them into a comfortable duopoly. It wasn't about who had the best ideas, it was about who held the debt. And here is where the story gets really interesting. Because Morgan's power wasn't just over private corporations. By 1895, it extended to the United States government itself. In the aftermath of the Panic of 1893, the American economy was in a severe depression. Unemployment hit 20% in some areas. European investors, terrified by the economic instability and the political push for the free coinage of silver, began demanding their investments be paid in gold. They started draining the U.S. Treasury. By early 1895, the U.S. Treasury had less than $60 million in gold reserves left. The United States government was weeks away from defaulting on its obligations. President Grover Cleveland was desperate. He tried to issue public bonds to raise gold, but the market didn't want them. The nation was staring into the abyss of sovereign bankruptcy. Enter J.P. Morgan. Morgan took a train to Washington and sat down with the President of the United States. He didn't come to offer advice. He came to offer terms. Using an obscure Civil War-era statute, Section 3700 of the Revised Statutes, Morgan proposed that he and a syndicate of European bankers, led by the Rothschilds, would privately buy $65 million worth of U.S. bonds in exchange for 3.5 million ounces of gold. Furthermore, Morgan personally guaranteed that he would use his influence to stop gold from flowing out of the country. Cleveland had no choice. He accepted. Morgan's syndicate delivered the gold, the Treasury was saved, and the panic subsided. But the implications were staggering. A private citizen, an unelected banker operating out of an office at 23 Wall Street, had just bailed out the sovereign government of the United States. Morgan made a handsome profit on the bond resale, estimated at several $million, but the money was secondary. The uncomfortable truth was that Morgan had demonstrated that the financial power of his syndicate was greater than the financial power of the United States Treasury. The state had bowed to the banker. Now, keep that playbook in mind, because Morgan was about to apply it on a scale that the world had never seen. Fast forward to 1901. Andrew Carnegie was the undisputed king of steel. He had built Carnegie Steel into an industrial juggernaut, ruthlessly efficient, vertically integrated, and overwhelmingly profitable. Carnegie was an industrialist in the purest sense. He hated debt. He hated Wall Street. He believed in building better furnaces, cutting costs, and producing physical goods. But Carnegie was getting older and he wanted to retire. Morgan saw an opportunity to apply Morganization to the entire American steel industry. Through a series of intermediaries, Morgan asked Carnegie for his price. Carnegie wrote a number on a slip of paper, $480 million. That is roughly equivalent to $17 billion today. Morgan looked at the paper and said, "I accept." Just like that, the greatest industrialist of the age was bought out by the greatest financier. Morgan took Carnegie Steel, combined it with several other major steel companies, and created United States Steel Corporation. It was the first billion-dollar corporation in history, capitalized at $1.4 billion. For context, that was larger than the entire national budget of the United States at the time. But here's the critical thing that most historians gloss over. That $1.4 billion valuation was largely an illusion. U.S. Steel didn't have $1.4 billion worth of factories, furnaces, and inventory. More than half of that capitalization was water. Stock issued beyond the actual value of the physical assets, representing expected future monopoly profits. Morgan took massive fees for organizing the merger, roughly $50 million, and he saddled the new company with enormous debt. This is the moment the American economy fundamentally transformed. U.S. Steel was not an industrial triumph, it was a financial product. Morgan had taken an industry built on physical production and turned it into an instrument for financial speculation. The executives of U.S. Steel weren't steelmen, they were lawyers and bankers. The focus shifted from making the best steel at the lowest price to managing debt payments and paying dividends on watered stock. This was the financialization of the American economy, and it happened in 1901. Morgan's appetite for consolidation was insatiable. He didn't just want the railroads, he wanted the oceans. In 1902, a year after creating U.S. Steel, Morgan set his sights on the transatlantic shipping industry. He formed the International Mercantile Marine Company, or IMM. It was an ambitious attempt to monopolize the shipping lanes between Europe and America. He bought up the White Star Line, the Leyland Line, and several others, aiming to control passenger and freight traffic across the Atlantic. He pumped $120 million of capital into the venture. But here is where Morgan's system met reality. The ocean is not a railroad track. You cannot own the ocean, and you cannot stop competitors from sailing on it. The IMM faced fierce competition from the British Cunard Line, which was heavily subsidized by the British government. But Morgan's company pushed forward, commissioning massive, luxurious new ships designed to outclass anything on the water. One of those ships was the RMS Titanic. When the Titanic sank in 1912, it wasn't just a maritime tragedy, it was a financial catastrophe for Morgan's trust. The IMM eventually went bankrupt, proving that Morganization had limits. But even in failure, the underlying philosophy remained intact. Morgan believed that competition was a destructive force that had to be corralled by capital. If he couldn't control the ocean, it wasn't because the theory was wrong. It was because he simply needed more capital, more leverage, more debt. Then came the ultimate test of the system, the Panic of 1907. If you want to understand why the world works the way it does today, you have to understand those few weeks in October 1907. The American economy had been running hot. Speculation was rampant, fueled by unregulated trust companies that acted like banks, but operated with a fraction of the reserves. When a copper speculation scheme collapsed, panic swept through Wall Street. Depositors rushed to withdraw their funds from the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest in New York. The Knickerbocker collapsed. The panic spread like wildfire. Banks stopped lending to each other. The stock market began to freefall. The city of New York informed the mayor that it was bankrupt and would default on its obligations by Monday. There was no Federal Reserve, no singular authority, no lender of last resort. The entire financial system of the United States was hours away from total disintegration. Once again, the government was powerless. The Secretary of the Treasury literally moved into a hotel room in New York and waited for J.P. Morgan to tell him what to do. Morgan, now 70 years old and suffering from a severe cold, stepped in. He gathered the presidents of the major banks and trust companies in the library of his Madison Avenue mansion. He sat in a red velvet chair by the fire, smoking large cigars, acting as the de facto central bank of the United States. He examined the books of the failing institutions. He decided which ones would be saved and which ones would be allowed to die. When the stock exchange president came to him in tears, saying the exchange would close if he didn't have $25 million by 2:15 p.m., Morgan orchestrated a pledge of $27 million from the banks in 15 minutes. When the trust companies refused to contribute to a rescue fund, Morgan literally locked the doors of his library. He pocketed the key and refused to let the most powerful bankers in America leave until they signed an agreement to provide $25 million, the last holdout signed at 4:45 in the morning. Morgan saved the system, he halted the panic, but he also used the crisis to his advantage. When the brokerage firm Moore & Schley was on the verge of collapse because it held massive amounts of stock in the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, a major competitor to U.S. Steel, Morgan offered a solution. U.S. Steel would buy Tennessee Coal. He sent emissaries to President Theodore Roosevelt to ensure the acquisition wouldn't be blocked by antitrust laws. Roosevelt, terrified of a deeper depression, agreed. Morgan saved the market, but he eliminated U.S., Steel's biggest southern competitor in the process. Make of that what you will. Now comes the part of the story that gets really uncomfortable. In the aftermath of the Panic of 1907, the American public woke up to a terrifying reality. The entire financial security of the nation rested on the shoulders of one elderly banker with a bad cold. The public outcry was deafening. The Pujo Committee was convened in 1912 by Congress to investigate the money trust. Morgan was called to testify. He famously declared that credit was based on character, not money. The first thing is character before money or anything else. Money cannot buy it, he told the committee. It was a brilliant piece of theater, painting the consolidation of wealth as a moral meritocracy. If you had credit, it was because you were a good person. If you didn't, it was a moral failing. But the committee's findings painted a radically different picture. They revealed that just 180 individuals, the partners of JP, Morgan & Co., First National Bank, and National City Bank, held 341 directorships in 112 corporations with total resources of $22.2 billion. That was more than the assessed value of all property in the 22 states west of the Mississippi River. The concentration of power was absolute. It wasn't character, it was a cartel. The politicians realized that Morgan's power was too vast for a democracy to tolerate. So they decided to create a public institution to take over the role Morgan had played in 1907. An institution that would act as a lender of last resort, provide elasticity to the money supply, and regulate the banking system. They called it the Federal Reserve. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The Federal Reserve was not designed to dismantle Morgan's system. It was designed to institutionalize it. The secret meeting at Jekyll Island in 1910, where the framework for the Federal Reserve was drafted, was attended by Senator Nelson Aldrich, Morgan's political ally, and Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Co. The architects of the central bank were Morgan's men. They understood that Morgan was mortal. He died in 1913, the very year the Federal Reserve Act was passed. The system needed a permanent mechanism to ensure the stability that Morgan had provided by locking bankers in his library. The Federal Reserve replaced the man, but it codified his method. It created a system governed by bankers designed to protect the financial infrastructure above all else, socializing the risks of the banking sector while keeping the profits strictly private. And that brings us to today. The forces that J.P. Morgan unleashed haven't disappeared. They have conquered the globe. When you look at the American economy today, you are looking at Morgan's masterpiece, the massive consolidation of industries where 3 or 4 megacorporations control airlines, telecommunications, agriculture, and tech. That is Morganization. The rise of private equity firms that buy up productive companies, load them with debt, strip their assets, and extract massive fees, that is exactly what Morgan did to U.S. Steel. When the Federal Reserve orchestrated the bailouts of the largest banks in 2008, injecting trillions of dollars to save institutions that had recklessly gambled with the global economy, they were performing the exact function Morgan performed in his library in 1907, but they were doing it with taxpayer money instead of private capital. You live in a debt-based system. From the student loans required to get an education, to the mortgages required to own a home, to the credit cards required to bridge the gap between stagnant wages and rising costs, debt is the oxygen of the modern economy. And every dollar of that debt pays interest to the financial sector. The transition that Morgan initiated, the shift from an economy ruled by people who make things to an economy ruled by people who finance things, is now complete. The financial sector no longer serves the real economy. The real economy exists to service the financial sector. These are not relics of a bygone era. They are present with us right now, shaping every transaction you make. The next time someone tells you that the economy is struggling because of inefficient markets, or that bank bailouts are a necessary evil to save the working class, remember this. The architecture of modern finance wasn't an accident. It was designed. It was designed to eliminate competition, concentrate wealth, and ensure that the ultimate power always resides with the creditors, never the debtors. And the reason for that design has always been money. If this exploration of hidden history resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. We're digging into the economic forces that shape our world, the power structures that operate behind the scenes, and the stories that the mainstream narratives often leave out. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on whether the Federal Reserve actually serves the public, or if it just replaced Morgan's library. I read every single one. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.